Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ModGear. This week, I'm driving the Alpine A110, a simple rally legend born from France and used quite many forms of Renault parts, let's be honest. So, let's just get right into it, shall we? But before we begin this week's episode, let's take a step back in the past for a brief history lesson. Our story on the A110 begins in 1961. Alpine, for the first time, was planning to launch a brand new car to replace the previous generation A108. And thus, they brought out the A110, which is basically the successor to the A108. There really wasn't much of a difference, but it's a new car, let's praise them. This new car was actually surprisingly solid and had a lot of good things going for it. The car looked very surprisingly aggressive, especially for the 60s, because, well, Alpine decided that they needed to redesign the rear bodywork of the cars for some reason, and so therefore that made the car a lot more aggressive looking. So, you're definitely gonna, not crab yourself down the street because it's not that aggressive, let's be honest. And well, as I said before, this car used a lot of parts from Renault, whatever you want to call it. I would assume that's probably because Renault and Alpine probably had a very good standing relationship back in the 60s and into the 70s of when the A110 was produced, because again, eventually down the line, Renault did actually buy out Alpine for their own use, as we'll get to in a bit. A very good example of why Alpine actually used a lot of Renault's parts was that when the A110 was first actually put on sale, it was first offered with a 1.1 liter R8 Major or R8 Gordini engine, and these engines were both roughly around the same cars that Renault made around the time. But more specifically, the cars that they mostly came out of were the Renault 8 and the Renault 10 of the 60s and into the 70s. So therefore, they basically just had Renault engines underneath them, so basically you were just driving a Renault, let's be honest here. But most of the A110's fame, similar to that of, say, like the RS200 or the WRX, for example, or even like the Toyota Celica or the Stratos, most of the A110's fame comes from rally racing. The car was given only like a very small amount of upgrades, since again, these cars didn't make anywhere near 100 horsepower on their stock engines. So they were given a lot of upgrades to actually compete for rallycross and rally, racing events around the world. So these cars were now making around 125 horsepower for rally racing and could do around 130 miles an hour. Some of the car's most notable rally victories include, actually, surprisingly enough, the Monte Carlo rally in 1971, driven by, once again, a French driver, because again, Alpine's based in French. The A110 had started its life with a very, very small 956cc 55 horsepower engine, and well, it was slow, let's put it that way. But considering that these cars only weighed like less than 2,000 pounds, they did go pretty quick. So it didn't really matter if you had 50 horsepower or 100, it was still going to be quick because, again, it was super light. But these cars actually had a surprisingly large amount of engines, both being from Alpine, some of them being from Renault, and there was even an engine from Lotus in there that you could put in your car. But again, it didn't matter what engine because these cars weighed super, like nothing basically. So therefore, they would go at least 100 miles per hour regardless of how much horsepower you had. So therefore, they also were really fun to drive because, again, you could just throw them around the B roads and they would do whatever they want. As of today, the A110 lives on in a concept car that Alpine revealed in 2012, also known as the A110-50. It was basically a modern rendition of what the A110 would be were it be made today. And Renault, since they had already bought Alpine a number of years back, and sometime, because again, buying companies, Renault ended up making the brand new A110, and it's now being sold pretty much all over the world. It's a really good car because, James May did a review of it, let's be real here. Altogether, the A110 was a fun, light, and awesome rally car, and it was built to go, around those B roads, have fun with it because they were light, had very small engines, and just altogether, they were actually surprisingly really good little cars. And today, you could probably still purchase a newer A110, and it'd still be as much fun as ever. But anyway, with that history lesson out of the way, even though I butchered it quite literally, we can get to this week's episode. Take it away, Panda. Thank you, Mr. History Panda, and with that, we can begin today's tests, starting with a top speed test. Welcome to the Genesis 1 Mile Dragway. It's a place where many cars come to push their engines and, well, a surprisingly large amount of their speed, you wouldn't actually believe it, to their limit, simply to put their speed onto the boards. So let's see how well the Alpine can do in this test. The Alpine A110, whichever you want to call it, topped out at a surprisingly slow 84.9 miles per hour. It's definitely a bit slower than I expected, but this is still a good number either way regardless of how powerful the car is. It's a solid run either way from the A110. Next up is the ABS locks of the brake test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to make sure that all 4 of the car's brakes once it stops once it passes this white line. The goal of the test is to not hit the parked Nissan Leaf, and if you do, you want to measure your distance based on how far the Nissan Leaf moves from its parking spot. So let's see how well the Alpine can do in this test. The Alpine does have slippery brakes, but with more time to stop, this would definitely be better. And besides, even though the Leaf did move a bit from its parking spot, it didn't move that far, so I'm not going to give it a bad score. It's definitely an okay run from the A110. Next up is the cornering test, and to do that, I've come here. This is the Forksville test circuit. Developed by the ModGear development team, it's used to help judge a car's endurance on tight corners, tight bends, and jumps, to further prove how a car might perform on a track-focused setting. So let's see how well the Alpine can do in this test. The Alpine does pretty well in this test. Some of the things that I noticed while we were doing this test includes that the steering does feel a bit stiff, but it's very minor, and this isn't really that big of a worry. Second, the suspension basically just feels like it's literal jelly, and you can see that from our airtime during jumps, hitting bumps, that kind of thing. And lastly, the car can spin out if it takes a corner too hard, spins out from like a jump or hitting the ground, or if it hits a curb. But other than these things, it's definitely a very good run from the A110. Next up is the reverse track of the parallel park test. The goal of this test is very simple. We want to make sure that we can park the Alpine between these two parked Renault Meganes. And when we do, we want to make sure there's enough distance both in the front and in the back of the car for someone to walk through. So let's see how well the Alpine can do in this test. And with tremendous ease, the Alpine passes this test. Next up is the lumps in the pillows on the gravel road segment. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well a car can endure day-to-day driving conditions, whether this be bumps, potholes, cracks in the road, a slippery road, or, uphill for some reason. We just want to see how well cars can endure suspension travel and just see, if a car is going to be destroyed or not. So let's see how well the Alpine can do in this test. The Alpine did pretty well in the gravel road segment test, but there are two things that definitely worry me. The first is the exhaust. The exhaust in this car is constantly hitting the ground, which definitely worries me, but I would also consider that to be the back end hitting the ground, but we're going to just say it's two different things because it kind of is. And second, the car just bounces a lot, as the jelliness is just a little bit too much from the suspension. But aside from these things, it's still a solid run from the A110. Next up is the bump in your seat on the bump test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how well a car can endure large bumps, to see how their front end and back end can cope, as well as their undercarriage. And while we've already seen a little bit as to how this car can endure those things, because again, that exhaust is really bad, but let's see how well the Alpine can do in the bump test. The Alpine didn't really do great at all in this test. Once again, the exhaust is basically just slamming into the ground, and the undercarriage is going to be scraped but not necessarily destroyed. And the car has even launched into the air once at a very high pace, much higher than the Koenigsegg CCX that we featured a few weeks ago. So it's a very unfortunate run from the Alpine. Next up is the nauseousness of the slalom test. The goal of this test is also very simple. We want to see how body roll and a loss of cornering can affect a car while on a track-focused setting. We already know a little bit as to how the Alpine corners and body roll and whatnot, but we're going to go ahead and test this anyway, just to get a better idea. So let's see how well the Alpine can do. The The A110 does really well in the slalom test. My only major complaints are that the steering once again does feel a little bit stiff, but this is easy to correct. And the car does have some minor body roll, which does affect it a little bit in cornering and losing some speed. But other than these things, it is an awesome run from the Alpine. The Mpg figures that the Alpine has, well, actually, I couldn't find any figures for this particular model of the Alpine A110. So we're just gonna have to run this car until it runs out of fuel, I suppose. So how do these unknown figures, we're just gonna say, apply on the track? And now, let's give the Alpine A110 an official lap around the Futaro circuit.
2, 1.
The official standard time is 2:15:62. With added up accidents and collisions, the final adjusted time is 2:15:62.
Hey there. Good to see you're joining us for this event. You'll be racing against 3 other drivers. There will also be obstacles along the track for you to tackle. Line up at the start line whenever you're ready, and we can get started. By the way, good luck out there, kiddo.
It's raping time.
I'm gonna give you 5 across the ass!
Let's get ready to rumble!
Let's do this.
Bring me that back.
Oh no!
Let's do this.
I don't give a fuck.
God fucking damn it!
Well, shit.
What up, biatch?
Oh no!
Hey, that's pretty good.
Oh, what the fuck? Oh no!
Fuck him up!
Run, bitch! Run!
Oh no! Oh god! What the fuck? What the fuck? Okay. Well, that was a load of shit.
Let's get the fuck out of here right now.
So, what are my final thoughts on the Alpine A110? Well, this car does have a lot of potential. It's good in corners, solid on a rally course if you want to go there, and has decent speed to back it up on all of these things. But its jelly, broken suspension, we're just going to say, its broken exhaust whenever it hits a bump, stiff steering, and unknown Mpg figures definitely make it one questionable purchase. To be completely honest, I would recommend this car as a great daily or weekend car, but it's very unclear as to how you're going to enjoy it. If you're going on the corners on a rally course, or something like that, and you're going to like this. But the jelly suspension is definitely going to suck. Having to change exhausts constantly is going to suck. Stiff steering might be a problem, and not knowing how much fuel you're going to have based on its Mpg figures is not going to help either. So if you do buy one of these cars, just make sure you're watching your fuel gauge so you don't run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, on that jelly-like note, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night.